Hello and welcome to History Roundtable. I'm your host, Ian Nolan Wethington. Today, we're going to talk about one of the favorite topics of historians and history buffs, war, specifically those of the 20th century. However, this being my strange little show, we'll be approaching it from a much more obscure direction, comics. I'm going to have my guest introduce himself.
I am Eric Nolan Wethington, father of Ian Nolan Wethington.
So, why don't you set the stage for us here, kind of tell us what the time period we're dealing with here is.
All right, well, really, we're talking late 30s up through the end of the war, basically. So I think what we're going to kind of limit ourselves to for this podcast. I say late 30s, even though we didn't get involved in the war until, 42. The first time we see propaganda, military propaganda in the comics is from the Don Winslow of the Navy strip. It was a newspaper strip, but it was reprinted in a comic book form, which was in Crackerjack Funnies, which that was the first comics were basically reprints of the newspaper comic strips. And so that's where we first see that enter comics, naturally, is from the comic strips. But then even with that, still before 1939, I think it was 1938, in Amazing Mystery Funnies number 13, in the strip Daredevil Barry Finn, which was original to comics. Yeah, that's the first time Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini appear in a comic book story.
So what kind of stories were these comics?
Well, those at that point, you weren't getting into any kind of major conflicts really at this point. Like I said, the Don Winslow of the Navy, that was really just kind of it was more of a recruitment tool than any kind of thing about the war per se. It's just, join the Navy kind of thing. This Daredevil Barry Finn, it was more of the Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini appear in one panel, basically. So it wasn't like a big statement of America should join the war kind of thing. It was more of just a political statement of fascists in general, I think. And that particular strip was had more of a sense of humor about it. So it was, just kind of like, it was more like an editorial cartoon in a sense. But then in 1939 also, you get your first appearance of the Shield, who was the first patriotic hero. I think a lot of people think of Captain America, but before him, from MOJ publications, which later became Archie Comics, we had the Shield, and that was in Pep Comics number 1, released in November of 1939. Now, he would never fight Nazis, but he fought spies here in the United States, basically saboteurs, that kind of thing. So at this point, he's not doing that kind of thing, really. He's just a patriotic kind of hero. You kind of had to see the gears of potential war churning, so you kind of have that rise of patriotism in the comics as well, but nothing confrontational yet. And then in War Comics number 1, that's from Dell. That was released in December of 1939, 1 month later. In the Scoop Mason War Correspondent strip, we see an American selling munitions to Germany. So that's kind of what you're seeing. And in Skyhawk, you see something about the Japanese-Chinese conflict. Mm-hmm. So you're seeing some commentary about this buildup of Germany and Japan and where things are kind of heading. But again, you see the Americans not involved really. They're just kind of commentating. In fact, he's actually reporting for a British newspaper, I think, if I remember correctly. But then, you don't have to wait that same month, actually, from Marvel Comics. Actually, at that point, they were called Timely Comics. You had their character called the Angel, not the same Angel as in the X-Men. He's actually fights Nazis in December of 1939. And 1 month later, in January of 1940, Marvel Mystery, again, number 3, you have Namor, the Submariner. He joins the Allies. He comes into conflict with Nazis as well, the Nazi submarines, U-boats. So it's funny seeing well before America gets involved in the war that some of the superheroes are getting involved in the war. And part of that could be, down to like with Namor and the Angel, you have Jewish editors. They're more on top of what's going on in Germany, I guess maybe, and have more of a stake in what's going on. It's not just the Jewish community of the comics, which there were a lot of Jewish creators as we see with Superman, Siegel and Schuster. In February of 27th of 1940, there is a 2-page strip called "How Superman Would End the War" that Siegel and Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel did with Superman. Hitler and Stalin are put on trial by the United Nations in that story. But it was mostly promoting war bonds and stamps. DC Comics, who was publishing Superman, didn't really do a lot of war stories. Superman and Batman, their major characters, would promote war bonds throughout the war, but they didn't really get involved too much with Nazis. But Marvel, as I said, they were full out front with getting involved with the Nazis.
And this sort of writing of these comics, it sort of seems like the political cartoonist of the of other wars. In the Russo-Japanese War, we had cartoonists depicting both sides as well. In that time, Russians and Japanese weren't particularly well liked in America, but there's just giving their opinion on the war. And I think this is an interesting parallel. I mean, it is still cartoons in a way, so I think it's interesting to think about it in that kind of way.
Well, yeah, like I said, a lot of times when you see in these early, before the United States gets involved in the war, a lot of times when you see them dealing with the comics dealing with Nazi Germany and Japan, mostly Nazi Germany. They didn't really touch on Japan that much until after Pearl Harbor. It's really depicts Hitler in an editorial, political, cartoony kind of ways as a cartoon character. And I think we can talk more about caricature and racial stereotypes when Japan enters. The Germans, when they would depict the Nazi Germans, you get a lot of play on the language and the accents, and they really play it up and make exaggerate the accents in the dialogue. Well, not just that, but it gets really cartoony with that kind of thing. But I mean, they're not really demonized per se as they did with the Japanese after Pearl Harbor. Well, we'll get to that when we get a little bit later. But for now, I mean, it's really like I said, it's more playful, not really playful, I guess, but cartoony in the things, and there's not really a lot of realism involved with those stories yet. So more in 1940, like with Wings Comics in June of 1940, you've got the Skull Squad. You have one American who joins the Royal Air Force, so it's the Skull Squad is a team of 3, one of them being American, but they're part of the Royal Air Force of England. So they're fighting Nazis, but not under an American flag. So that's another way you see getting around. In that same comic, you have the Parachute Patrol, which is a group of French young boys who are fighting against the Nazis, and you have Clipper Kirk, who's a Canadian. You have F4 of the Air Intelligence, who's British, and then Blitzkrieg Buster, who's British. So you see all these people fighting Nazis, but none of them are American in this comic. The next month, though, July 1940, National Comics brings iconic Uncle Sam image to life as a comic book character.
By the way, one of my favorite comic book characters.
Yes, I know you're kind of obsessed with him. So Uncle Sam is based on the same image that was first portrayed in the editorial cartoons of the 1800s and more famously portrayed in the James Montgomery Flag 1917 recruitment poster featuring the "I want you" for U.S. Army. That was for World War I, but it was also reused as a recruitment tool in World War II, so the image was very well known. But he's a superhero, and he has kind of undefined powers per se, and he's fighting Nazis in 1940. Uncle Sam. I think that's really the first time besides the Marvels, the first time you really see someone wrapped in the flag fighting Nazis. In November of 1940, Captain Marvel, which at the time was the best-selling comic, he fights the Nazis with a G and a T. But he's not really. He's doing it to protect refugees. So he's not really taking the war to Germany, the Nazis, as as they playfully describe them. That really was cartoony kind of presentation of the conflict. But then, of course, in December of 1940, you get the famous comic book cover of Captain America punching Hitler. Now, inside the comic, he's only fighting saboteurs and the Red Skull, who's he's an underling of Hitler. But it's the covers was where we see the superheroes fighting Nazis the most. In the actual stories, you're not necessarily fighting Nazis all the time. You're fighting saboteurs again a lot of the time, or this or that. But on the covers don't always portray what's inside, and it's the covers where you see a lot of the again with DC. It's on the covers where they're promoting the war bonds, but inside they might not have a story about that. But on that cover, there's a patriotic cover of Superman holding an eagle, or Batman and Robin firing a machine gun, which he didn't use guns in the stories at that time. So it's really on the covers where they really try to grab the interest and show what they're wanting to do there. And there's another Uncle Sam character as well, not published by a different publisher. This is from Target Comics. That's in same month, December 1940, as Captain America. But it's more of a serious approach where he's asking you to support national defense. So he's not really fighting anybody. He's just more of a propaganda cut, or not even really propaganda. I guess you could call it propaganda because it's asking for a certain thing, but it's not overtly propagandistic. It's just trying to raise support for the national defense. In April 1941, we get Daredevil battles Hitler. And with this cover, it's kind of interesting because you actually get more of a photorealistic image of Hitler on the cover, which is kind of the first time that's happened. It really gets more into it's that story is more involved with Hitler than probably any other story done. We get Hitler's base in Berchtesgaden, and you got Hitler relying on a crystal ball, which plays with the idea of Hitler's obsession with the occult, or supposed obsession with the occult. It's playing it for laughs, and there's a sign in the background of one panel that says, "The bigger the lie, the more people will believe it." Now, that's in Goebbels' office. He's fighting with Hitler in Singapore and in Africa. He has a dogfight with Goering. He fights Van Roder at sea. And in the back, there's actually a little biography on Hitler, which is kind of interesting. So that one really, that's like the first time a whole issue is devoted to the war, really.
And for those of you with keen ears, he did say, "Bigger the lie, the more they believe." That is a paraphrasing of a quote from Mein Kampf, something Hitler actually wrote.
So we've got more of that coming along. In Superman 13, this October 1941, it's the first time DC show gets really involved outside of just supporting war bonds and kind of things. You've got the cover shows Superman punching a German boat. No stories inside of them fighting Nazis, but again on the cover, a different story. And this is an interesting comic, too. In October of 1941, in National Comics number 18, we get another Uncle Sam story. And this one, quote-unquote, Oriental bombers raid Guam, and their fleet attacks Pearl Harbor as a diversion for the German invasion of Portland, Maine, and Boston. So he got part of it right. It's kind of weird how they kind of predicted that almost.
And very impressive.
Well, I guess it's safe to assume that if Japan was going to attack the United States, they'd start in Hawaii. But still, it's kind of eerie when you think about it. A year ahead of time, or a little over a year ahead of time. Mm-hmm. Another interesting comic, Master Comics number 21, in November of 1941. You get the first appearance in Fawcett Comics of Captain Nazi. He's fighting Captain Marvel and Bullet Man. So this is like the first Nazi supervillain you see, besides, the Red Skull, I guess. But he's actually wearing. This is like the first time you see him wearing the swastika on his chest. Mm-hmm. And then another interesting comic, Real Life Comics number 3, December 1941. It's a biography of Adolf Hitler called Adolf Hitler, Emperor of Hate. So, I mean, that's really, like I said, with the one with Daredevil Battles Hitler, when you get a short little biography, and then this real life comics, I mean, you're really trying to raise social awareness of what's going on overseas. In these pre-war stories, I mean, they're showing that like they're trying to depict the Germans as not caring about the common soldier. You don't really see caricatures of Germans, like I said, just in their language is really it. But sometimes they're drawn kind of dumpy or something, but they look pretty normal otherwise.
It's more of a fat joke than a stereotype.
Right. But then, after Pearl Harbor, like I said, the caricatures of the Japanese get really monstrous at times.
So once we entered the war, the story started changing a lot, and as you said, the caricatures start becoming grotesque. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's once we enter the war, there's a huge rise in the number of war comics, and you're not just getting superheroes, but you're getting actual war comics. Not that many war comics, really. I mean, there would actually be more war comics in the 50s about the Korean War than there were war comics featuring real soldiers. Well, not real soldiers, but normal men soldiers in World War II. Really, the war years of the comics were really dominated by superheroes all the way through. Although you would still get guys of that Don Winslow type, where they were military men. But those stories were mostly kind of rah-rah, gung-ho kind of stories where the good guys always win in a heroic fashion. Nobody really gets hurt. There's no blood and guts kind of stories like you would see in the 50s. There would be a lot of times there'd be a girl being captured by an evil German scientist or something like that, or a Japanese demonic-looking guy capturing the female, the military guy's gal or whatever. So even when you didn't have the superhero, you still had that superhero stereotype of the damsel in distress playing out even in the war comics a lot of times. And like I said, it's really more about the superheroes still for the most part. In February 1942, Captain America number 13, you get kind of a replay of Captain America number 1, except this time Captain America is punching Tojo in the jaw. So, and again, no interior story for that one. And then Captain Marvel Adventures number 8 in February of 1942 as well. You get Cap marching alongside servicemen of different branches of the military. And that's kind of a theme that played out a lot in the comics from during the war, where the heroes will be marching alongside soldiers, not necessarily fighting, but looking heroic.
And that's something you sort of get in the comics post 9/11 is the heroes marching alongside the servicemen that were there and the firemen, the policemen that were there at the towers.
Right. It was all about trying to have this sense of unity, because that's what the country was really trying to do at the time was, join do your part. Everyone has to do their part, whether all it means is recycling or doing a food drive or, not buying a steak that week. It's all part of pulling together as a country. So, and the covers reflected that for the most part. In All Winners number 4, March 1942, you get a story with the title, "The Terror of the Slimy Japs." And you see that a lot more. I think, like I said, the Japanese not only were caricatured more than the Germans, but there was a lot more slang about them. I mean, yeah, the Germans were called Krauts, but the Japanese, they got a lot more of that Japs and nips and worse in the comics.
Let's leave it at worse.
And I think it had to do with Pearl Harbor. I mean, because it was deemed a sneak attack, that sneaky Jap kind of language that was going on at the time was really played through in the comics as well.
Although I will say it probably also has to do with the fact that the Yellow Peril was very popular at the time.
Oh, sure. And you even had that before the war. When Daredevil battles Hitler, one of the villains he's facing is the Claw, which was the epitome of the yellow peril of the comics at the time. He was actually a fairly popular character. He had his own strip, even though he was a bad guy. But he was depicted as a demon. He was actually, that was part of his background. He was born in China, and he was basically a half demon of sorts. He was the yellow peril personified, and you get a lot more of that kind of thing when you're seeing them fight the Japanese in this comics than with the Germans. In April of 1942, Harvey Comics put out War of Victory Comics #1, and this is really where you start to see, around this time, April, you have to have a little lead time to do the comics. So it's a few months after Pearl Harbor, you see a lot more of the war comics coming through, and War of Victory Comics, though not a very long-running series, was one of those early war-themed comics. But all profits of that issue were contributed to the USO and Army and Navy relief funds. So that was kind of an interesting concept. And that was Harvey Comics, who later became famous for Richie Rich and Casper the Friendly Ghost. In Master Comics #27, you get the famous cover of Captain Marvel Jr. doing his V for Victory symbol on the cover with the V behind him. And here, this is something new for DC. In Green Lantern Quarterly of June 1942, Green Lantern and his sidekick Doiby actually joined the Army. They don't really stay there very long, but it's and it's kind of play for laughs in a lot of ways. The Doiby character is he's the comedic sidekick kind of thing. So you get a lot of comic relief through that. And DC, like I said, DC Comics at this point during the wartime, they don't really take the war stories. They keep them light and adventurous rather than depicting the horrors of war kind of thing.
So it's more like the old Donald Duck cartoons where Donald Duck joins the army and has to go through boot camp.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it gets a little more involved in that, but it's pretty much stays on that kind of playful level.
All right, so now let's talk a little bit about the people who were making these comics. Many creators of this time served in the war. So can you tell us about a few of these?
Sure. Let's start with the guys who created Captain America. We'll start with Jack Kirby, who was the artist of Captain America. He began his basic training in June of 1943. He was assigned to the infantry as a soldier and mechanic. He joined the Omaha. When he reached Omaha Beach in August 23rd of 1943, he was assigned to a machine gun platoon, Company F, 2nd Battalion, 11th Regiment, 5th Division of Infantry, 20th Corps of the 3rd Army. That's under Patton in Verdun. During his time in the service with that company, he helped liberate Gortza and Novion, which was south of Metz. It was during this time he would go out on reconnaissance missions where he made observation drawings. So his artistic background came into play during his time there. He was part of the Dorno Bridgehead mission in September 1944, which is the kind of infamous crossing of the Moselle River near Dorno. The American troops were not expecting Metz to be heavily defended, but they were wrong. The Germans had just reinforced that area. He was part of his battalion was part, and the 23rd Army Infantry Battalion were both supposed to cross at this area. There was a mix-up about who was to go when, where. So they lost a lot of casualties trying to get across the river. When they got across the river, they were supposed to attack the Fort St. Blaise. That was in Kirby's company, Company F, along with Company G, were leading that charge. So he was in the brunt of it. They could not breach the fort because of when they got there, they encountered moats and anti-grappling walls, and so they had to fall back. And they took a lot more casualties at that point. They dug in at the bridgehead, and they had to defend 36 counterattacks while they were made sure that another bridgehead was secured before they retreated. And so eventually they did get across the Moselle and head to Metz, where they had the big German outpost there. But during those attacks, as they were trying to secure the outer defenses of Metz, the little forts and castles outside of the city, Kirby got trench foot, and he had to be removed from the front line. He nearly lost both his feet, but he was able to. They were able to keep him, luckily. While he was in hospital in France, he helped the doctors by making anatomical drawings of the trench foot and from other soldiers as well as himself, and the doctors loved him for that. His art came in handy again, and so he arrived back in New York in January of 1945 and spent the rest of his time in a motor pool in Raleigh at Camp Buckner. His partner Joe Simon, who wrote and inked the first Captain America story, he had a little bit of an easier time during the war. He joined the Coast Guard early on, before he was drafted. So he remained in the Coast Guard throughout the war. He was at one point he was transferred to Washington D.C. as a draftsman in the combat art section. And while he was there, he drew propaganda comics. One was called "Adventure Is My Career," and another was called "True Comics," which both of them were about the Coast Guard and why you should join the Coast Guard and that kind of thing. So then we get to Bert Crispin. Crispin had been a newspaper strip artist early in his career. He worked on a very popular strip called Scorchy Smith, and that was from 1936 to 1938. Then he joined DC National Comics and co-created the Sandman character with Gardner Fox. He had gone to college for mechanical engineering. He was always interested in aviation. He actually got his pilot's license in 1937. He joined the Navy in the summer of 1938 as an aviation cadet. He kept doing comics while he was in service, at least for the most part, until 1941 of March of 1941. He and two of his friends in his unit were recruited for a covert mission in Burma, and they joined the Flying Tigers. They became part of the 2nd Pursuit Squadron of the Flying Tigers, the Panda Bear Squadron. In December 11th of 1941, he flew a long-range reconnaissance flight over Bangkok in Thailand, where they found a massive buildup of Japanese aircraft. So they knew that they assumed that the Japanese were going to be attacking Burma at some point soon. And they were right. In January 4th, 1942, he was shot down, but he was able to parachute to safety in that time. On January 20th, his plane was damaged in an air fight. And on January 23rd, his plane was one of 18 to be launched as an intercept to 72 Japanese planes heading to Rangoon. His engine was shot up. He had to jump out and parachute, but this time he got strafed by a Japanese fighter while he was descending, and he died in that strafing. The AP picked up a story about him. It was a national story. We got a lot of coverage. Paramount did a short documentary on him for the films. And later on in 1942, the United States government featured him for war bond ads. So he got pretty well known about for a time for his service as part of the Flying Tigers. In fact, in his hometown of Fort Collins, Colorado, the airport there was renamed after him, Crispin Field. And then we'll move on to Will Eisner. Will Eisner was best known for the Spirit newspaper strip. In fact, when he got into the Army, he was one of the few guys who people actually knew who he was because he was first assigned to a camp in Maryland, and the Baltimore paper carried the Spirit. So the people there saw his name and knew who he was. So because of that, he had tried actually to get a deferment before being drafted based on the fact that he ran a studio and he had several artists under his employ. So, and if you had more than 5 artists who depended on your business, you could apply for deferment. So he actually did that, but he was denied the deferment. But they did give him several months to get his affairs in order, and his Spirit strip kept on. While he was in the Army, he actually kept writing it, but he had artists at his studio drawing it. So he was inducted in May of 1942 and assigned to the Ordnance Department at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. He started out there just drawing editorial cartoons for the camp newspaper, The Flaming Bomb. The Ordnance Department there had actually started taking on this idea that the British had come up with, that they called preventive maintenance. And basically, the idea was take care of your stuff before it breaks, so it doesn't break down on you in battle. I mean, it seems kind of obvious to us now, but at the time, in the heat of battle, you didn't always think about doing things like that. You're just trying to get by and fix things as they broke. So the Ordnance Department was basically very involved with trying to get soldiers in the field to follow this advice and do preventive maintenance to make things more efficient and safe for their soldiers and make them more effective in battle. So Eisner suggested doing something through comics and to get the ideas across, because most of the manuals that the guys in the field would get would be these very technical manuals, and a lot of the guys didn't have the education to really follow what they were talking about, because they used very technical words, very stiff, and so when Eisner he did a few sample posters using a cartoon character he called Joe Dope. He just kind of used it in very casual, everyday language, and the soldiers really responded to that. And so he was then transferred to Holabird Ordnance Motor Base in Baltimore. They asked him to take the warrant officer test so he became a warrant officer. So he kept making posters, and then there was this instruction sheet. It was basically more of like a small pamphlet kind of thing called Army Motors that they would pass out to the soldiers. And it was, like I said, it was full of the technical jargon. So Eisner started doing cartoons for that, again, using the Private Joe Dope character he had done some of the posters for. And it became extremely popular with the soldiers. They sent it to every shop involved in vehicle and weapons maintenance, and it really got the ideas across, and it was very effective. So he got transferred to the Pentagon to continue this process, where he worked under General Levin Campbell, who was the chief of ordnance. So he had a huge effect on the war just from those comics. And later on, after the war was over, he would kind of do the same thing with PS Magazine. He had a big section on that for many years. He bid on a contract for that, and would rebid every so often, and kept that contract for many years. And he'd also get when he would travel to the different bases, the soldiers would often comment on how his comics had really helped them out, figure out what they needed to do. So yes, that's just another example, a big example of how effective comics were during the war. Mm-hmm. And then there's Nick Carty, who I was lucky enough to be friends with. He started out in the 66th Infantry Division, which was known as the Black Panther Division. He was a G3, and G3 as a map maker originally, which makes sense. He was an artist. In fact, he worked with Will Eisner. He was part of Will Eisner's shop before he got drafted. So this was like the Black Panther Division had just been formed, really. They hadn't been around very long. So they had a contest with the soldiers in the unit about what their insignia should be, their logo. And Nick drew something up, and it won the contest. So the Black Panther, you see the Black Panther patch with the panther head, that was drawn by Nick Carty. So when he went to the headquarters to accept have a little ceremony for the winning the contest, the general there wanted to paint his portrait. So he started. He was, would hang out at the officers' mess and sketch the officers. But then one of the Corps generals saw him and decided to have him transferred to his outfit, because he wanted an artist in his outfit. In order to get him over there, they had to promote him, because that was the only slot they had open. The only slot there for him was in the motor pool. So he was transferred to Texarkana, but when he got there, they were in the middle of shipping out to the Pacific Theater, and they didn't need him. So they sent him back to his unit, but because the paperwork had already been gone through, he didn't really belong there either. So he was put in with a group of unassigned soldiers heading to Europe. Now, one of the 66th Division's transport ships was later torpedoed by German boats, German subs, while crossing the English Channel from England to France. So that could have been him, but like I said, he wasn't part of that group anymore. So instead, because he'd been involved in the motor pool, even though he never worked on a car, they put him in with a 3rd Armored Division as an assistant tank driver. Just because he had, because of circumstances, been temporarily transferred to a motor pool. He didn't even know how to drive at all. He couldn't even drive a car at that point. But with the 3rd Armored Division, he was part of the spearhead into Germany. Yeah, he went through Belgium and Cologne and took part in the capture of Cologne. He was part of the group that discovered the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. But then in a small town outside of Berlin, there was a big fight there, and he had to abandon his tank, and he got shrapnel in his leg while they were holed up there. So he got sent back to Paris before he made it to Berlin. It was funny. He would tell war stories, but he would never really tell about the action, the firefights and things. He would always talk about he liked to talk about his time in the hospital. Again, he did drawings, anatomical drawings for the doctors while he was there as well. He would talk about stuff like that. Or his favorite story was actually when one night they were getting ready for bed, and most of his crew would like to sleep under the tank. But there was one of their guys would always sleep in the tank, and they would always get on him about it. Like, if anyone's going to shoot at us, they're going to shoot the tank first. So you're safer under the tank. But he refused. He always wanted to sleep inside the tank. So they had parked on a kind of an overlook on a hill, and so in the middle of the night they woke up and realized that the tank had sunk on them. Evidently, the ground was a little sandy. The soil was very loose. The tank had actually sunk down and pinned them to the ground. It was, it would have probably continued and crushed them. So they were banging on the bottom of the tank trying to wake the guy up. But he didn't know how to drive the tank. They had to talk him through it to get the tank off of him. That was one of his favorite stories to tell. But so he ended up with 2 Purple Hearts during his time in the war. And the next guy I want to talk about, he probably has one of the most interesting stories to me. That's Paul Norris. Now, Paul was best known as the artist of the Brick Bradford newspaper strip after the war. But before the war, he worked in comics, and he was actually the creator of Aquaman. I was lucky enough to interview him in his home in 2007, just a few months before he passed away. A friend of mine, David Siegel, was friends with him, and he was the one who kind of brought him back into the comic scene after many years of being away from it. When he was drafted, he was assigned to the Signal Corps. And he started out at Fort Ord, California for basic training as part of the 82nd Signal Battalion. He ended up being assigned to battalion headquarters, and he worked his way up to technical sergeant in charge of plans and training for the battalion before they got shipped out. When he actually got to the Philippines, he was still with the Signal Corps, and his job was to keep the lines of communication working. Sometimes the local civilian women would steal the line to hang out their wash or something, but sometimes the Japanese would sabotage the lines and try to set an ambush. Luckily, nobody was ever taken in by this. Okay, so in 1944, Paul is headed on a ship to Okinawa. That's for the final stages of the invasion there. And while on board, he's approached by 2 officers from the psychological warfare branch. They'd seen his cartoons for the ship's newspaper and wanted him to draw some posters. Paul called them surrender pamphlets, but basically what they were was they told and showed through pictures and words the Japanese soldiers how and why they should surrender. Paul's ship actually was involved in the kamikaze attacks. His ship was luckily to make it through okay. Paul actually would send a ring made from shrapnel of one of the kamikaze planes to his son Mike in a letter home while he was on Okinawa. His son Reed thinks that the kamikaze attacks occurred when they were anchored offshore, or perhaps just before they got to Okinawa. And I should mention Reed because he provided a lot of the information that I've got on Paul. I did, like I said, I interviewed Paul in 2007, but since then Reed's been doing a lot of research trying to fill in the gaps in Paul's memories. And I just talked to Reed last month at the Comic-Con International in San Diego. He gave me a lot of good stuff, and he was kind enough to send me some of the artwork that Paul had done during the war that I hadn't seen when I was there. And speaking of Paul's memories, Reed told me that Paul had very strong memories of the kamikaze attacks, and he would, whenever they would watch a show on television about the war and the kamikaze attacks would be shown, that Paul would kind of leave the room and kind of be agitated and kind of wander in and out of the room, and so it definitely shook him up. So Paul's group lands on Okinawa sometime before June 4th, probably just a couple of days before June 4th. We know that because of a letter that Paul sent home dated June 4th, 1945, which clearly was written after he was established on the island. Once there, he takes up the same duties that he had in the Philippines, maintaining the lines of communication. Meanwhile, the leaflets that Paul had done, and among with leaflets from other artists, were being dropped all over the island, and they started showing results. So General Buckner, who was in charge of, he was the commander of the 10th Army, he was also a big proponent of PSYOP. He had Paul transferred to the 10th Army G2, which is their intelligence office, to draw more of the leaflets. And ironically, the day after Paul's transfer order came down, Buckner was killed at the Battle of Surrey Castle. Paul made it in under the wire, so he was moved over to G2, where he worked on more of the leaflets. One of the things they did to make sure that the leaflets would be effective was they would actually talk with the Japanese prisoners of war they had already captured. And among the men that Paul talked with, there was actually a commercial artist and a painter. He became friends with a couple of those, and one actually gave them a painting while they were there. But through talking with these prisoners, they were able to get really inside their heads and find out the best ways of convincing them to surrender. The Japanese had always trained their soldiers that had always kind of spread the rumors that the Americans would torture them and just, you don't want to surrender because you won't live, you won't like it, you won't live through it. Mm-hmm. So it was just made it much more effective. For example, one of the pamphlets that Paul had the art for, there were basically 5 pictures on this one sheet of paper. The first picture showed a Japanese soldier putting down his rifle. Okay, and then the second picture showed him taking off his uniform, and then the next picture had him with his arms over his head, surrendering to a U.S. soldier. And then here's where it gets interesting: is the next 2 pictures, you have the Japanese soldier smoking a cigarette, sitting on a cot, and then another one with him eating a bowl of food. And there's kanji, Japanese kanji there describing what's going on there. But basically it's telling him, surrender and you'll be treated well, and this is how you surrender. Make sure you come alone, without your uniform, without your weapon. But Paul also had started working on a sequential story that would be dropped over the island. Most of these pamphlets were literally just one sheet of paper, but this one was going to be an 8-page story. He never finished it, but I saw one piece of art for it that Paul kept after the war. Basically, it was the story of a Japanese soldier who was trying to decide whether to surrender or not. And it's the story of him going through that decision, and in the end, this part wasn't drawn, but it was scripted out. In the end, he decides to surrender because an elderly Okinawan woman and her grandson or something like that wanted to be safe, and so the Japanese soldier surrendered with them, took them with him, and so they would be safe. That was his way of justifying his surrender. But like I said, that one was never finished, so we don't know how effective that might have been compared to the standard pamphlet. Like I said, the standard pamphlet was just a one sheet, but those were generally considered very effective because over the course of the battles there on Okinawa, planes dropped over 6 million of these, what Paul called surrender pamphlets. And the results were, over 11,000 Japanese soldiers surrendering. And they kind of can make that connection. How many of them really were because of the pamphlets? Well, we don't know for sure, but, a lot of them surrendered in the way the pamphlet suggested, with, coming out of no uniform, with their hands over their head, no weapons, in singles rather than in groups. So it was generally thought to be a very successful program because it's that universal language where you don't really, your pictures can say words that can't always translate. Mm-hmm. But this was like the first large-scale use of the PSYOP, which is kind of funny because the general consensus back in the United States, in the War Department, in Washington, D.C., was basically that the Japanese would never surrender. And it was part of that dehumanization that you saw in the caricatures. It was they weren't like us. They wouldn't surrender when they felt their backs were against the wall. They'd fight to the death. But some people in the military who talked with Japanese prisoners of war, realized that wasn't the case, and that the psychological warfare could be effective. And Paul was a big part of its success. After Okinawa was finally captured, Paul was transferred to the 24th Corps and shipped to Korea. And basically his job in Korea was the same as it had been there in the latter stages at Okinawa, which was mainly going about the surrender of the Japanese troops stationed there. But he also had other kind of side jobs too, about the establishing stability within the nation of the Koreans there. So his job was a little bit different, but very similar in a lot of ways. And he worked with some Nisei language teams and a Russian language team while he was there. So it's he continued that a little bit after the war while he finished his service.
That is so interesting. I love this kind of stuff, folks. So let's go move on to the off-topic question of the day. What comics are out now that are worth getting?
Oh, there's a lot. There's actually a lot of comics right now. This is like a golden period for me, I think. For a long time, comics had gotten narrowed down to where if you didn't want superheroes, there wasn't much else. But right now, there's something for everybody. Whether there's a big boom in science fiction and crime fiction, and so there's tons of stuff. I suggest just looking around and see what you want. Some of my favorites right now are Saga, Southern Bastards, which is it's about a football coach who kind of runs a town. It's like you couldn't have. Who would have thought of that? Getting a comic in, but yeah, there's something for everybody. So. Another one of my favorites is Paper Girls, which everyone's talking about Stranger Things on Netflix right now, the TV show. If you like that, you got to check out Paper Girls because it's got a very similar vibe. Paper Girls actually started before Stranger Things, but it's these four girls who have paper routes and the strange adventure they get into. There's a lot of science fiction and time travel, but it's got tons of 80s references. That's by Brian K. Vaughan and Cliff Chang. Cliff Chang is the guy I actually did a book with a couple years ago. You go by your library. Libraries have gotten into comics now. They're big supporters of that. So that's a good way to try things out, or look online. You can find previews of anything. Yeah, so there's tons of good stuff out there. Any kind of subject you can think of.
And for those of you out there who are not only history fans but also horror fans, I would suggest Manifest Destiny out by Image right now. It's pretty great. So now we're going to go into the book recommendation. Going to look at, not look at, but to suggest you read Nick Cardy, The Artist at War. I actually only recently got it. It's pretty great. Reading Nick Cardy actually talk or write about his experiences and show his illustrations and some of the work he did. Add anything to add to that?
Yeah, that was put up by Little Eva Productions a few years ago. It should still be in print. Actually, there's a version that comes with a DVD documentary that's basically an interview with Nick. He was a pretty good storyteller, just verbally as well. He liked to talk a lot, so so it's worth checking out for that, definitely. And I got to see a lot of that stuff personally. He kept a lot of. He would draw whenever he had a chance during the war, so he kept a big sketchbook from his time there. Some of the stuff he would draw just whenever they had downtime, and just images that he. From the day before or the battle they had just gone through, so there's not just there's some casual shots. There's also there's a lot of photographs as well that he kept. So yeah, that's a good one. There's also Will Eisner, A Spirited Life. I designed that book. There's a big section about his time with PS Magazine. That's pretty interesting.
Also, if you're interested in PS Magazine at all, you should check out the collected edition of that. But that's 3 book recommendations. You got a little extra today. So I just want to thank my dad for being on the show and thank all of you for bearing with me and continuing to listen. Now I'm going to leave you with Shostakovich's Jazz Suite No. 2, Part 4, Waltz.